Hello, church. Uh, Good to be with you again in another Exodus mini. We are actually today going to be starting to work our way through the 10 plagues that are found from Exodus 7, middle of Exodus 7 through chapter 11. The 10 plagues, and 10 plagues really along with the laws in the second half of the book of Exodus are the kind of the primary catalyst for starting doing these Exodus minis. The whole idea of doing these is to give us sort of an opportunity to engage with the text in a more serious way without, at the same time, without having to get kind of bogged down in Sunday mornings and taking a really long time to kind of systematically go through everything. So Exodus is already going to be kind of a long series, and this was in some ways my way of kind of balancing that out just a little bit. So we're ahead of ourselves in our systematic study, but this is to set up when we get to Exodus 7 in a few weeks, the ability to kind of go through that whole 4.5 chapter section in really one Sunday morning sermon. And I obviously won't read through the whole text, and we'll kind of skim through it, but this kind of gives us the ability to look at this. Now, again, one of the main reasons is because there is a lot of repetition that's happening in the 10 plagues and in the laws that we see in the second half. What the idea is I'm going to release 2 videos a week, or that's at least going to be the attempt. Obviously, I haven't gotten one every single week, but the attempt will be I'm going to release 2 videos a week covering 2 plagues, 1 plague in each video. And after this one, right after this first week in the plagues, the plan will be I will simply read the text. I'll jump right into it, read the text, and then give a little bit of an explanation of the significance, or even maybe more purposefully put, the Egyptian god that is being addressed in the particular plague. So there's 2 general beliefs or general interpretations of the 10 plagues. The first is, and the one that I personally hold to, and that I will kind of share with you through this, is that each of the 10 plagues is kind of direct attack upon an Egyptian deity or deities, plural, right? Like maybe there's more that are being addressed in each one, but we'll talk about the most likely, or the most commonly held belief through each of them. The second belief is that the 10 plagues, while they might be addressing some, very few people deny that the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, is not a direct attack on Ra, the sun god. But then there's a couple others, maybe the frogs and the gnats and things like that, that people are like, well, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch to say that there's a particular god being addressed here. That the point is actually just God showing his power and his might. And I agree with that sentiment. What we have to believe, what we have to get, is that God is addressing or showing his power and his might. That's the most important thing. It's interesting to think about the different gods that might be being addressed in the plagues, but it's important that we don't get too carried away with that and too dogmatic about it, too kind of closed-fisted about that. So again, we're gonna take this sort of with a relatively open hand, but it fits with the purpose of the book of Exodus. The purpose of the book of Exodus being giving God credit, giving God kind of standing within the community. So think about it like this. Moses is going to go starting in chapter 5 through the middle of chapter 7. We're going to see this kind of picture being painted for us then over the next 2.5 chapters. That Moses is going to go to Pharaoh, and he is going to say to Pharaoh, let my people go. Let my people go out into the wilderness and worship me. This is like, similarly, this is like, say, the mayor of Creston, Ohio, or Rittman, Ohio, or some small rural town in Podunk, Ohio, going to the President of the United States and saying, if you don't let us become our own nation, I'm going to bring down the full force of my power. We can understand how that rings a little hollow. And that's essentially what's happening. Moses is going to go to Pharaoh, who believes himself to be, at least in some sense, a deity, a god. And this guy, coming from this people that they have had in servitude for hundreds of years, probably at this point, is going to say, the God of my people is going to destroy you if you don't listen to us. You can see how that might not really play out. So here in these plagues, God is going to show his power, is going to show his might, and show that he's not just another one of the many deities, the family gods of a particular people. He is the God of the universe. And that's the main thing that we have to take from the plagues, and ultimately from the book of Exodus as a whole, that God is in fact sovereign and king and ruler over all things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read the text. I'm going to jump right into it from here, right? So starting in week 2, I'm going to jump right into the thing. I'm not going to give any kind of introduction, so these can kind of be seen in a continuous picture. And then I'm going to talk about the God that is potentially being addressed, and maybe some of the significance of that God that's maybe being addressed. And then we'll kind of move our way through in that regard. So let me read the first plague. Exodus chapter 7, verse 14. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, and when you see him walking out to the water, stand ready to meet him by the bank of the Nile. Take in your hand the staff that turned into a snake. Tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But so far you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. Here is how you will know that I am the Lord." There's that, again, credibility that is being built. "Watch, I am about to strike the water in the Nile with the staff in my hand, and I will turn it to blood. And the fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink, and the Egyptians will be unable to drink water from it." So the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the water of the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, canals, ponds, and all their water reservoirs, and they will become blood. There will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the wooden and stone containers." And Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded in the sight of Pharaoh and his officials. He raised the staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile was turned to blood. And the fish of the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad the Egyptians could not drink water from it. There was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same thing by their occult practices. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. And Pharaoh turned around and went into his palace and didn't take even this to heart. All the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water and to drink, because they did not drink the water from the river. 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. So, a few things that we're seeing in this account. Before we address who Happy is here, this Happy. The first is a couple of the obvious, right? This is the first plague. It's the first plague amongst the 10 plagues, so it has some level of importance in that regard. We don't really need to talk very much about that. That's a fairly obvious one. The second is that there is a connection here between the plagues, the signs that Moses has given, and he's given 3 signs in the wilderness to come to the people of Egypt, or come to the people of Israel, and to give him credibility. We talked about this a few weeks ago, what the purpose of the signs are. The purpose of the signs, it's not just to perform some magic trick, it's to give some credibility to the person who is talking, right? Moses is going to take the staff that's in his hand, throw it down on the ground, it's going to become a stake, he's going to pick it up, it's going to become a stick again. This is a supernatural event to say what Moses is about to say and do is important, is from Yahweh, is from God, right? The second sign was put your hand in your cloak, pull it out, your hand is diseased, put it back in, pull it out, it's clean again. And then the last plague, the third plague, if they don't believe those first 2, the last plague is take some water, don't do what we're doing in the first plague, take some water out of the Nile, pour it out on the ground, and it will become blood. This sign, the sign that we're calling a sign, and then the first plague are the same idea, right? We can see how these 2 things are the same. And so what's happening is that there is a connection being made between the plagues that are happening in Egypt and the signs that Moses was given to show both the Egyptians, or both the Israelites and the Egyptians, right? Moses was given credibility because of the signs, but now, sort of in addition to those signs, Moses is also receiving some credibility with the plagues, but more importantly, God is receiving credibility from the plagues. Again, a mayor going to the president and saying, let my people go, let my people become a nation, has no value. But a mayor who has power and status might come and have a whole different response. Okay, so those are kind of the obvious things. Who is this, again, likely addressing? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the sign of the water turning to blood a few weeks ago, but this is likely addressing one of a bunch. So there are something like 1,500 deities in the Egyptian mythology. There are tons and tons. We do not live in a world where every single thing has some spiritual deity related to it, right? Everything in the ancient world, especially in Egypt, had some divine connection, some supernatural deity connection to it. The same thing is obviously true here. There's a couple different gods over the Nile River for different things and different reasons. One of them, sort of the chief one, is this Happy. I'm not really sure if that's how you would pronounce it. Maybe a hard H or a guttural H, a Happy, but I don't really know. It doesn't really matter. Happy is a god of fertility, a male god of fertility with female body parts and pregnant, right? And the picture is that the Nile River, during the spring rains, during the flood season, the rains would come and the Nile River would burst forth from the banks, would go over across the banks and would flood the area, and that flooding would cause fertile ground. It would bring good soil. It would fertilize. It would make everything able to grow, right? And so there's this kind of picture of, a year-long gestation and then finally birth and fertilization. So the god of the Nile River, Happy, is a god of fertility. So you would pray to and worship and bring sacrifices to this Nile River god to ask for the ground to be fertilized, ask for your wife to have a baby, whatever it might be, right? So this is where that worship is coming from and directed. Here, Moses goes, or the Lord goes, to the Nile River, and in a very sort of clever twist of sort of life reality, takes the water that brings life and replaces it with the blood that is life in man. If I lose the blood in my body, I'm going to inevitably die. But the water is the blood of the earth, and so therefore there's this sort of twisting of pictures here that is a direct attack upon the god of the Nile River. And this attack is showing us something, right? It's showing us the God of the Hebrews in some ways, and we don't want to take this too far because this is not actually what is happening. We know that God is the only God. He is the only God. All these other gods are false gods, or maybe demonic forces, whatever it might be. But God is the only God. So we know that the reality is not necessarily what is being pictured, but what is being pictured is that God is going from family God over here, small and insignificant, to sort of moving his way up the kind of ladder of importance. He can attack and overpower and win out over the Nile River God. He can attack and win out over bigger, more important. And while there is not a sort of linear progression from lowly God to most important God, there is sort of a progression from lowly God to more important God. Ra, Pharaoh, those kind of things, 9th and 10th plagues are much more important than maybe the Nile River God, right? Not that the Nile River is not important, it's extremely important, but it doesn't quite have the same weight as Ra, the sun god, okay? Now, two other things that we're going to notice, and I'm just going to point them out because we'll talk about them when we get to this in our Sunday morning services. Notice, one, that the Egyptians, the magicians of the Egyptians, are able to reproduce this. Some suggest that this reproduction is just a sleight of hand, kind of magical whatever, that it's not really blood. I disagree with that interpretation. I think that they actually, through supernatural, evil, demonic forces, have reproduced the plague. To the same extent, no, at least not being indicated for us within the text. This is what brings the hardness of Pharaoh's heart to mind, right? Pharaoh's heart was already hard, and then the plague happens, and then the magicians are able to reproduce the plague, and so therefore, Pharaoh's heart remains hard. And we'll notice that it is Pharaoh's heart remaining hard because of the situation that is happening. Not because the Lord is making his heart hard, not yet, but because Pharaoh's heart is already hard and remains hard because he sees, yeah, you're able to kind of win out over, so you're not a lowly, nobody, nothing God, but you're still not to my level. There is an indication that there's very little fear from Pharaoh in this moment. He casually, nonchalantly turns around and walks back into his palace. So that's plague number one, the plague of the Nile River turning to blood. See you in the next one.